A debate, like the debate between internalism and externalism, can grow pretty involved. There can be lots of distinctions introduced. I mean, if you delve into this literature, you're going to find dozens of versions of internalism and externalism. You're going to find many different examples that are being discussed, and then the internalist and the externalist don't really agree about what the examples prove or whether they're important, and so on and so forth. And it might leave you a little bit confused. I mean, are these people really talking about the same thing? Is there a way to find out who is right and who is wrong? What actually is at stake here? I think that's the right question. What is at stake here? And so what I want to do with this video is I want to take a step backwards, and I want to look at some of the different ways that we can approach epistemology. And I'm going to suggest that internalism and externalism can be thought of as ways to try to explicate and develop these different ways of approaching epistemology. And at the end, we'll ask, well, what's the relationship between these different ways of approaching epistemology? Are they exclusive? Or might we do all of them, right, in order to get a broader and more interesting epistemology? Okay, so what I'm going to do is I am going to talk about three things, three distinct divisions in how to approach epistemology that we can connect to the internalism-externalism debate. And here's the first one. We might think of epistemology as engaged with the first-person attempt to find the truth. Right? So the idea would be this. When in epistemology we think about knowledge, what we are primarily interested in is in becoming better at getting knowledge. Right? What we want is we want tools and ideas that we can use, right? That I can use, or that you can use, or that maybe we can use together if we're working together, that we can use to attain true beliefs, right? Or to get to knowledge or understanding or whatever it is that we're after. And so whatever we're doing in epistemology should be something that is useful from this first-person perspective of a person who is in the world and who's trying to gain knowledge about that world. Okay, so that's one way of thinking about the use of epistemology. And this is, for instance, what epistemology is for somebody like Descartes. And in general, actually, what epistemology is for thinkers of the 17th and 18th century. And probably a long time thereafter too. It's about, how do I improve my quest for knowledge? Okay, but there's another way of thinking about epistemology. We could also think about epistemology as a sort of third-person project of assessing epistemic states. Right? We see somebody, that person has certain beliefs, and now we want to know, well, is it knowledge? Yes or no? And we sort of take an outsider's perspective. And if you look at something like a justified true belief analysis of knowledge, well, that seems, at least in part, to be an outsider's perspective. Right? If I say, well, that person knows this stuff only if it's a justified true belief, then at the very least, truth is going to be assessed from a third-person perspective. Right? I'm even maybe imagining myself in the perspective of some all-knowing God. Right? Somebody who knows the truth and who can therefore say, oh yeah, no, sorry, this is not knowledge because it's not true. So analyzing the concept of knowledge the way that we do in 20th century epistemology seems to fit fairly well, at least in many of the ways that it's been done, fairly well with the idea that what epistemology is interested in is giving a third-person perspective on people's epistemic states. And then saying things like, yeah, they're justified, yeah, they have knowledge, or no, they're not justified, they don't have knowledge, and so on. Now, what does this have to do with internalism and externalism? Fairly clearly, internalism fits well with the first-person project. Right? If you're focusing on what is accessible to the subject, if you're focusing on like a first-person perspective idea of responsibility, you are really doing a kind of epistemology that aims to make me better epistemically. Whereas, if you are doing something, embracing something like reliabilism, like an externalist theory, you are clearly more in the camp of somebody who tries to give a third-person perspective on epistemic standings, right? And you want to say, oh, well, that person He actually used a reliable method, even if he doesn't know it, and so he has knowledge. So, one of the ways to understand the distinction between internalism and externalism is to think of it as, well, there are these two different projects, right? What do we want to achieve in epistemology? Do we want to become better at finding the truth? Or do we want some sort of bird-eye view or even God's eye view understanding of epistemic states? Well, maybe we want both, in which case there are two different projects that we are engaged in, which might be related in certain ways, but need not be exclusive, right? Need not exclude each other. Okay, so that's one distinction that I think is relevant when we think about internalism and externalism. Here's a second distinction. It has to do with who epistemology is about. So one way of thinking about that is to say, well, look, concepts like justification and knowledge and so on are extremely demanding, right? For instance, in order to have knowledge, you must be justified. In order to be justified, you must give reasons, have reasons, be able to give reasons. So you need to be able to do quite a lot, right? Maybe you need to be able to use language, to use logic, to see how certain beliefs logically hang together, to give arguments. You need all of that in order to be justified, in order to have knowledge. And so epistemology is about rational beings. Basically, epistemology is about adult humans. Maybe epistemology is also about aliens, but we don't know of any aliens. Maybe epistemology is about certain artificial intelligences, although I don't think we have any artificial intelligence like that at the moment. Maybe epistemology is about children like from a certain age, but epistemology is not about very young children, for instance, who really don't have like the laws of logic at hand or can give arguments or reasons. It's not about certainly most animals because they don't think like that, like they don't have reasons, they don't give justifications. Epistemology is primarily about advanced cognitive subjects such as adult human beings. So that's one way of thinking about epistemology. Another way of thinking about epistemology is to say, no, look, I mean, something like knowledge, you got to understand it in terms of a certain ability to maybe deal with your environment. And that's an ability that we can see in adult human beings, sure, but also in young children and absolutely also in animals, right? And so what we might want to say is that the squirrel knows where it has buried its nuts, the birds know where to migrate, the bees know where the flowers are, and so on. Right? And on this conception of knowledge, well, knowledge is really not the same. I mean, it doesn't require like any sort of real higher order conscious abilities having to do with reasoning and argumentation. And something like reliabilism, which tells us that, okay, there has to be a reliable method, might actually fit this conception a lot better, right? I mean, if I were to say something like, you know, what the bees do is they just fly out and then they come back together and they have these weird little dances and the other bees see it and then they all fly in the same direction where the flowers are. Well, there's a kind of a reliable method there, right? If they dance this way and then fly that way, that reliably brings them to the flowers. I might want to call that knowledge. Right? And so here's a conception of knowledge or epistemic ideas in general that applies not primarily to adult human beings and then only sort of maybe derivatively to something like bees, but it applies like equally to animals, humans, children, maybe even machines. Maybe we could even say something like the heater knows that it's cold in the room and that's why it turns itself on, right? Maybe we even want to say something like that. It becomes much broader. So these are two different ways of thinking about the subject of epistemology. And again, one fits better with internalism, right? It's an easier fit with internalist theories to think of adult human beings who can engage in reasoning and in conscious reflection on their grounds of justification. That's easy to fit in with internalism, whereas a view of the subject of epistemology that could just as well be a bee or even a thermometer fits in better with externalism. I'm not saying that it's a sort of one-on-one connection, but we can see a sort of general affinity between these ways of thinking. Well, that second division has a lot to do with the third division that I want to talk about, which is how epistemic states fit into nature. So here's one way of thinking about how epistemic states fit into nature. It's a way of thinking that belongs to a very general philosophical conception that is called naturalism. Now, there are many ways in which naturalism might be defined, but one way of thinking about naturalism is thinking about it that, like, once we have a sort of natural scientific story about the world, that gives us all the basic building blocks that we need in philosophy. Not just in science, but in philosophy too. And so when we do epistemology, we should link it up to what natural science tells us about the world. And if we do that, and we start wondering about things like belief and knowledge, and the normativity of belief and knowledge, well, that normativity is going to have to be linked somehow to just things that happen in nature. And so we might have a model of the epistemic. Well, let's say we use something like a thermometer. Right? What's a thermometer? A thermometer is something that changes its state depending on the temperature. And if it works correctly, then it reliably changes its state depending on the temperature. And one temperature always leads to the same state, and another temperature leads to another state. Well, that might be our basic model of the epistemic, right? I mean, when we think about human beings, then too, maybe what we want to say is that a human being has knowledge or is justified if they reliably change their state based on the outside situation. So if we think that maybe human beings have to be understood as extremely complicated thermometers, right? And of course we need to tell a very complicated story about how human beings gain knowledge, but if we think that essentially it is about responding in certain ways to certain inputs, about linking certain inputs to certain outputs, then we have a broadly naturalist conception of the epistemic. And we really don't need to sort of introduce any new kind of story, right? We don't really need to introduce a new conception of normativity. I mean, that's a little bit difficult, always, normativity for the naturalist, because in nature things just happen. There's no good and bad. Maybe we can do sort of without that, or we can define the normative just in terms of having these reliable patterns, these patterns that always work the same way. And maybe we can understand anything that we want to know about knowledge just in terms of natural events, and we don't need to talk about things like a mind, for instance, or if we need to talk about a mind, maybe we can, just talk about the brain instead and claim that that's the same thing. There's a whole philosophical project there, extremely complicated, involving many parts of philosophy, not just epistemology, but involving many parts of philosophy, including the philosophy of mind and metaphysics, philosophy of science probably. And it seems to fit relatively well with externalism. Right? It seems to fit relatively well with the idea that human beings are not really different from bees or even thermometers. It fits relatively well with the idea that, we can look at all of this from a third-person perspective, because that's what scientists do, right? They look at things from a third-person perspective. They just describe it from the outside. And we've already seen that fits relatively well with externalism. So maybe this whole naturalist attempt at understanding, well, in this case, the epistemic, fits well with externalism. That is at least a promising path to explore. On the other hand, we might also believe that no, naturalism doesn't really work here. Epistemic standings are special, right? There's something special about being justified. There's something special about beliefs. There's something special about the normativity here, about the ought of what you ought to believe, that you can't reduce to nature, like to nature as described by natural science. That is in no way predicable of a thermometer, for instance. A thermometer can't be wrong. If we say that a thermometer is wrong, it's just because we are using our sort of what we want and our procedures and our normativity onto the thermometer. But for the thermometer itself, I mean, it's just doing things, right? There's no right or wrong. So you might think that this naturalist project doesn't work, and that there's something special about being an epistemic subject that needs to be analyzed in a non-reductive way, right? You can't reduce it, you can't explain it in terms of just the natural world. And that might work better when you combine it with a first-person project, when you combine it with the idea that adult humans are special, and therefore maybe with some kind of internalism. Okay, so we've seen three things that might be at stake here in how we choose to do epistemology. Is it a first-person project of epistemic self-improvement or a third-person project of understanding epistemic states? Is epistemology primarily about adult human beings and only derivatively can we say that a bee or a squirrel knows something? Or is it, about animals just as much as about us? Is our project a naturalistic project that tries to fit the epistemic into a world revealed by natural science? Or do we think that the epistemic is sui generis, right? Its own kind of thing that we can't just reduce to a natural scientific picture of the world? All of that is at stake in the internalism-externalism debate, but the relations between these three different distinctions and with internalism and externalism are complicated. You can't just say that internalism, if you're an internalist, then you have to believe these three things about how to approach epistemology, and if you're an externalist, you have to believe these three things about how to approach epistemology. No. I mean, there are many different ways to approach epistemology, there are many different ways to understand internalism and externalism, and the relations might be complicated. And so, working through the internalism-externalism debate with these things that are at stake in the back of your mind is a way of finding out how they could be linked, how they could be worked out, what kind of trouble you might run into, and so on. So let me give an example. I want to give you an example of how trying to pursue internalist or externalist perspectives here might lead you into trouble. Specifically, how it might lead you into the trouble of skepticism, which is one of the topics that we will talk about in a later week. So, for instance, suppose that you are an internalist and you say, well, everything, first-person perspective, everything is about what is accessible to you. Well, that means that here are two situations which internally are just the same. It's the situation where I perceive something, and it's the situation where I'm under an illusion, right? If I see an elephant, or if I have an illusion of an elephant, like I hallucinate an elephant maybe, from the inside it looks the same. So maybe, I'm not saying that this has to be the case, but maybe if you are an internalist, that means that you have to say that your epistemic standing is the same in these two cases, right? When you see something or when you hallucinate something, if you can't tell the difference from the inside, you have the same epistemic standing. Well, here's the problem. If you hallucinate something, you certainly don't know anything. Okay, but that means, if it's the same epistemic standing that you have when you actually see something, then the result is that if you actually see something, you also don't know anything. And so, internalism, understood in this way, seems to be a very quick road into skepticism. Right? Because sort of by definition, you can't tell the difference between real perception and hallucination. And the internalist claims that, that means that your epistemic standing has to be the same. And so whenever we perceive something, well, that's just as good, epistemically speaking, as hallucinating. And so there's no knowledge of the external world. Terrible. Maybe that is what internalism leads to. Or maybe it isn't. You'd have to think it through. We're going to think about this more when we come to the philosophy of perception. But it's something that we want to know more about. Is the internalist committed to this argument? How does this argument fit with the idea of having a first-person project of epistemic self-improvement? With the idea of, a non-naturalist epistemology? We want to think through the relations between those things. On the other hand, maybe externalism leads us to skepticism, right? here's a reason to think that externalism might lead us to skepticism. If the externalist is right, then, our what is accessible to us, what we are aware of, is irrelevant when it comes to whether we have knowledge or don't have knowledge. Right? But that seems to mean that from our first-person perspective, we just can't know whether we have any knowledge. Right? And if we can't know whether we have any knowledge, then that is also a kind of skepticism. Well, that's a fairly quick and dirty argument, but it seems that the worry of skepticism is, at least in part, that we don't really know from the inside whether we have knowledge, and it seems hard for externalism to give us any confidence, because the internal is just not really treated or not really seen as important by the externalist. So again, that's something that we would like to think through. I mean, is externalism sort of a route to skepticism? Or if not, I mean, how can it be blocked? And what does this have to do with these other projects, like a third-person perspective on knowledge, for instance? So, some of these ideas will come back to us, but I hope that one of the things that this video has clarified is how an extremely technical debate, like that about internalism and externalism, can at the same time be relevant for some of the deepest questions you might have about epistemology. Right? Is it a first-person or a third-person project? Like, what do we want to achieve with epistemology? Is it naturalistic or not naturalistic? Right? How do we think of the place of ourselves in nature? These are really deep questions. And internalism versus externalism is one way of trying to think through some of the answers that we might give to them.